The empire in Syria-Palestine had provided wealth, but it also required constant military expeditioning to maintain, and eventually, the costs exceeded the benefits. Climate change may have played a role again, as it had in the collapse of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom. Reduced Nile floods meant reduced agricultural productivity, reduced tax revenue, reduced state capacity. But there were internal factors as well. The priesthood of Amun had accumulated so much wealth and land that it rivaled the pharaoh's own resources. The religious establishment became a separate power base. The practice of rewarding military veterans with land grants created a class of military landholders whose loyalty was to their patron, not necessarily to the state. The bureaucracy became corrupt and inefficient, positions increasingly becoming hereditary sinecures rather than meritocratic appointments. Egypt, in the first millennium, before the Common Era, became a prize contested by outside powers. The Assyrian Empire invaded in the 7th century before the Common Era, sacking Thebes in 663 before being expelled. The Persian Empire conquered Egypt in 525 before the Common Era, ruling it as a province with Persian-appointed governors. The Egyptians rebelled repeatedly, temporarily regaining independence in the 4th century before the Common Era, but were reconquered by Persia. Then came Alexander the Great. In 332 before the Common Era, the young Macedonian king invaded Egypt with minimal resistance. The Egyptians, who hated Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He made the politically astute decision to present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh. He traveled to the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, where the priests declared him the son of Amun, giving him divine legitimacy in Egyptian eyes. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. When Alexander died in 323 before the Common Era, his empire was divided among his generals. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions, took Egypt. Ptolemy I Soter established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt for 300 years. The Ptolemies were Greek, spoke Greek, imported Greek settlers, patronized Greek culture. They built the Great Library of Alexandria, making the city a center of Hellenistic learning. They minted Greek-style coinage, organized the administration along Greek lines. But the Ptolemies also understood that to rule Egypt, they had to be Egyptian pharaohs. They supported traditional Egyptian temples, built new ones in traditional Egyptian style, and had themselves depicted in hieroglyphic inscriptions using traditional pharaonic titles and iconography. The Rosetta Stone, which would eventually unlock the ability to read hieroglyphics, is a Ptolemaic decree issued in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic for the priests, Demotic Egyptian for the people, Greek for the administration, symbolizing the hybrid nature of Ptolemaic rule. The Ptolemaic kingdom was initially powerful, controlling not just Egypt but also Cyprus, parts of Syria, and possessing influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But the Ptolemies repeated the old pattern. Dynastic infighting, civil wars between rival claimants to the throne weakened the kingdom. Ptolemaic power contracted. By the 2nd century, before the Common Era, Rome was rising in the Mediterranean, and Egypt was becoming a client state, nominally independent but actually dependent on Roman support. The last great struggle came in the 1st century, before the Common Era. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers, tried to preserve Egyptian independence through alliance with powerful Romans. First, Julius Caesar, with whom she had a son, then Mark Antony, whom she married, and with whom she had 3 children. Cleopatra and Antony challenged Octavian, Caesar's heir, for control of the Roman world. At the naval battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, their forces were defeated. they fled to Alexandria. The next year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, but when it became clear he intended to parade her in chains through Rome as part of his triumph, she too committed suicide, dying by the bite of an asp, according to tradition. On August 1st, 30 years before the Common Era, Octavian entered Alexandria. Egypt became a province of Rome, but a special province. It was so wealthy, its grain production so crucial to feeding the city of Rome, that Octavian kept it under his personal control, forbidding Roman senators from even entering without his permission. Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus, had himself depicted on Egyptian temples as pharaoh, maintaining the fiction of continuity, but everyone knew the truth. Egypt was conquered. The line of pharaohs stretching back 3,000 years to Narmer was broken. Roman Egypt was prosperous, but subordinate. Egyptian grain fed Rome. Egyptian wealth enriched Rome. Egyptian culture fascinated Romans, who adopted Egyptian motifs, imported obelisks, developed mystery cults based on Isis and Osiris. But Egypt itself was no longer an independent civilization. When the Roman Empire later split, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking and Christian. In 641 of the Common Era, Arab Muslim armies conquered Egypt, with barely a fight. The Byzantines were expelled. Egypt became part of the Islamic world, a transformation more profound than even the Roman conquest. The hieroglyphic script stopped being used. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 of the Common Era, carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae. After that, the ability to read hieroglyphics was lost, the knowledge dying with the last priests. The ancient temples were abandoned, sometimes converted to churches or mosques, often simply left to the desert. The pyramids remained, too massive to destroy, but their meaning was forgotten. Medieval Arabs thought they were Joseph's granaries for storing wheat during the biblical famine. The Sphinx was vandalized, its nose chiseled off, though by whom and when is unknown. For over 1,000 years, ancient Egypt was lost, buried under sand, overbuilt by later cities, its texts unreadable, its history reduced to garbled legends. Not until Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, when French scholars accompanying the army began systematic study of the monuments, did Europe rediscover ancient Egypt. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during that expedition and its eventual decipherment by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 finally allowed hieroglyphics to be read again. Archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries slowly reconstructed ancient Egyptian history from the physical remains and texts. Today, we can walk through the temples of Karnak and Luxor, descend into the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stand before the pyramids of Giza, and marvel at what the ancient Egyptians achieved. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, architectural accomplishments that still seem barely possible, a written language of incredible complexity and beauty, religious and philosophical ideas that influenced later civilizations profoundly. Egypt gave us the 365-day calendar. It gave us paper in the form of papyrus. It developed medicine to a sophistication unmatched until classical Greece. Its art and architecture influenced everyone who encountered it, from the Greeks and Romans to modern architects and artists. But Egypt also demonstrates the fundamental fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. Egypt seemed eternal to those who lived in it. The pyramids were already ancient when Cleopatra lived, older to her than she is to us. Egyptian ideology insisted on changelessness, on the permanence of Mayat, on the eternal nature of kingship. Yet Egypt fell. It fell multiple times, in fact, fragmenting and reunifying in a cycle that eventually ended with foreign conquest and cultural transformation. Why did Egypt fall? We can point to specific causes: climate change and Nile flood failures during the First and Second Intermediate periods, the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse that ended the New Kingdom, internal political decay, corrupt bureaucracies, overpowerful priesthoods, dynastic infighting, external pressures from rising powers, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the exhaustion of resources from maintaining empire, the challenge of maintaining cultural unity across vast geographic distances and long chronological spans. But perhaps the deeper answer is that nothing lasts forever, that entropy applies to civilizations as to everything else, that the very factors that make a civilization successful in one era can become liabilities in changed circumstances. Egypt's geography protected it, but also isolated it. When the world became more interconnected, when chariot warfare, and later cavalry, and siege engines and professional armies made the desert less of a barrier, Egypt's isolation became vulnerability. Egypt's ideology of divine kingship created strong central authority, but made the entire system dependent on having strong pharaohs. When weak rulers inherited the throne, as eventually they always did, the system faltered. Egypt's investment in monumental architecture and elaborate religious practices created cultural continuity and social cohesion, but absorbed resources that might have been invested in military modernization or economic development. The ultimate lesson of Egypt is one of impermanence.